Wonderful. So thank you all for coming today to our session on backwards design, using backwards design in a world language classroom. We're going to go ahead and get started here with our introductions and our land acknowledgements. So while we are introducing ourselves, I'll go first and then I'll let Hannah introduce herself. And while we're doing that, we'd like for you to just take a moment here, and I'm going to put this into the chat. A great website from the Canadian government that basically says what land Indigenous peoples had lived on and continue to, well, some cases continue to live on today, just to kind of acknowledge that. And so while I'm introducing myself, I encourage you to take a moment and look at that and go out there. So thank you all for coming. My name is Linda Burrows. I am the director for K-12 Social Studies and World and Native Languages here at ADE. Prior to that, I taught French, Spanish, and English, along with social studies in middle and high school. So I will let Hannah introduce herself real quick.
Hello, I am Hannah Rood. I'm the K-12 Social Studies and World and Native Languages Specialist. So I'm here to support you in all of your PD needs. If you have resources you want to share or you're looking for specific resources, I would be a great person to reach out to. And I am excited to be working with you guys and learning from you throughout this whole process. So thank you guys for being here.
Wonderful. And with that, while you are looking up where you are from and where your school maybe is located, using that tribal nation, telling us what grade and language and your first and last name into the chat, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Arizona Department of Education is located on the ancestral homelands of the Akimel Otham and Peeposh peoples. We recognize the Akimel Otham and Peeposh peoples as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. We also would like to acknowledge that without their knowledge and contributions, we would not be able to survive on these lands as guests today. We would also like to acknowledge that the Phoenix metropolitan area is actually home to one of the largest urban Native populations in the United States. So even if you don't have a lot of Indigenous people or students that you know, or you're maybe not teaching on a reservation in Arizona, you probably do have Indigenous students in your classroom. So making some of those cultural comparisons with our languages and with our Indigenous, peoples of the land that we live on is always a good thing to just acknowledge that we see them, recognize them, and that they're a part of our societies today. So I see we've got some people introducing themselves in the chat. So we've got Maria from Anthem teaching Spanish, fantastic. Elio, thank you for coming. Spanish also. Teaching ELL, wonderful. Mandarin immersion, fantastic. Thank you, Chin, for coming. Beverly teaching 5th grade ELA, wonderful. Teaching Mandarin, we've got some Spanish teachers. Great, we have got teachers teaching all different grade levels. So wonderful. So really today what we are focusing on, hello Lynn, it's good to see you today. What we're really focusing on is using backwards design, right? And how we can get that into how that can benefit and be used in a world language specific classroom. And really it goes for any languages that we may teach, English being one of them, right? So with that, just a little bit of some community kind of agreements to go over. So just as we're doing this, that we are all here to learn from each other. Hannah and I are not the experts on everything that has to do with world languages, so we do want to acknowledge and value your experience as well. And that we are all coming from different points in our journey. Some of you have maybe never used backwards design. Some of you maybe have extensive use of it. And so really we're just here to kind of discuss and learn from one another. Hannah and I also want to kind of honor and respect each person's experience as valuable knowledge. And so we've kind of designed this session so that way, not only will you learn from us, but that we can learn from you and that you can also learn from each other, especially when we get into some of our virtual learning breakout rooms. This is a virtual learning environment, so we do encourage you to take care of yourself during this time period. If you need to get a drink or just take a minute for a break, answer a call, whatever, just, make sure you're muted and take care of whatever you need to do for. And then the last is just to expect and accept non-closure. This is an 1.5-hour session, so there is no way we can get through everything that there is to learn with backwards design, but it is something that we want it to be an ongoing learning experience for you, that you can take this into the classroom. And today is not the only day that you'll be dealing with and learning about and putting into practice backwards design. So with that, our agenda today, we have just a few, we're going to review backwards design and its components. We did this a little bit in the Proficiency webinar, but we're really going to delve deeper into the individual components of backwards design, giving you templates and resources for that. I want you to really come out of this understanding the benefits of backwards design and its use, because it is very different from maybe the way you have currently been teaching. And then also examine really specifically those resources to use backwards design in a world language classroom. So with that, getting into what exactly is backwards design. So from a definition point of view, backwards design means planning and instruction with the end goals in mind. It's a framework where we have educators implement a proficiency-based language program over a realistic timeline and really base that on a current program model. So it's this idea that we really look backwards as opposed to forwards. And I have a slide here next, which I think illustrates kind of the difference of how we look at using backwards design in a world language classroom as opposed to just kind of a more traditional designing of your classroom. So a traditional design is where we identify a topic or content that needs to be covered. So this may be, the course considerations in our social studies topic. It could be the listing in science of the things that you need to learn as far as like life sciences, physical sciences. This could be a list of literature or books that you need to read in an ELA class, where you really kind of start with that content first. Then once you have that content, and this is how I used to design my classes years ago, you then plan lessons to teach that content. And then you create that assessment to measure, did the kids learn what I wanted them to learn? To how do I am going to measure that learning taking place in those lessons? So what's very different now going forward, and I've been doing this for years with the backwards design, is instead of starting with the content, you really start with identifying what your students should be able to know and be able to do by the end of that unit or by the end of the year. And so if you start with that measurement first, that assessment of where do we want kids to be, especially with regards to their proficiency level. Do we want to move them from an intermediate mid to an intermediate high? Do we want to move them from a novice mid to a novice high? Where do we want them to be and what does that look like? And that's where you start with your planning first. Then you determine that acceptable evidence of learning through different assessments, both formative and summative assessments. And then the last thing you do is actually plan your lessons to then meet those assessments and get your students there. And so it's a little different where the lesson planning is actually the very last thing that takes place. And really that identification of what you want students to learn and be able to do is where you start with. And then what you can do is you kind of chunk your time backwards from that. So with regards to world languages, why bother using this in a world language classroom? I've done this in both, and it honestly, backwards design suits itself very well to really any kind of content area. But today we're going to focus on backwards design in a world language classroom. So first, it makes that transition to proficiency-based standards easier. So since 2015, the World and Native Languages standards with the Department of Ed and for all Arizona students are really based on proficiency. So where is the level of communication in the modes of communication, interpersonal, presentational, interpretive, as well as our cultural components? Where are your students now? And then where do we want them to be? So in a DLI class, you're going to examine that and also bring in some of those content with that. Going forward from a kindergarten to like a first grade classroom, in a middle and high school classroom, it really is, okay, in a Spanish 1-2 class, where do we want our students, where are our students coming in? And then where do we want them to be after that? Going forward, another reason why is it develops structured formats when we're designing our units, our lessons and tasks with those functional goals and objectives in our mind. It also allows, I feel, an easier time for teachers who maybe teach different languages to be able to plan together as a core group. And so all of the German, Spanish, French, novice teachers can get together and figure out, okay, what does this 1-2 class look like? How do we get our kids to the next level, regardless of what language you're teaching? And that allows for some of that planning that, we know very oftentimes as world language teachers, you may be the only one in your class or in your school, or maybe one of 2 teachers. So this allows you to open that up to other teachers, plan a little bit more together, and then you can pull in those authentic resources for your particular target language. And then the last benefit that I see with backwards design is that it really focuses the learning on student outcomes. It's not on a test. It's not on, some district benchmark. It's not for an Apple or stamp test. It's really on what are the students learning. And when we're focused on that, it's going to help us get that engagement and that buy-in from our kids, which we all know we're really striving for after COVID, and also getting some of that social and emotional needs met by really focusing on what do the students' needs, what are their outcomes, tying that into their language learning is really going to be a positive piece going forward. So when we think of backwards design, and again, like all teachers, considering both Hannah and I have taught for years, right? It's always good to not reinvent the wheel and take what you can from other people. So this is actually from the Ohio Department of Education. They created this fantastic map, graphic organizer of what backwards design looks like for a particular unit. And we'll be getting into these in specifics, but basically it's 3 stages. It's identifying those learning outcomes, determining acceptable evidence that would meet those outcomes, and then planning those learning experiences. And so I just found this to really encompass everything with regards to world languages. And so with their permission, I am using it. And in fact, they have a lot that we are going to be using today. So again, like I mentioned before, there really are just 3 steps to backwards design. And again, this does come from the Ohio Department of Education. And I also took a little bit from the University of Colorado World Language Department as well. So the first step in identifying those learning outcomes is the components to consider. And so this is where we look at our state standards for Arizona. What do we require of language learning from Arizona State? What are the proficiency levels of our students? Where are they now? What unit themes you want to think of, essential questions, and then coming up with relevant can-do statements to meet those components. After you do that, then we're going to look at and determine that acceptable evidence. So this is where we look at, what assessments can show the achievements of learning outcomes, and specifically for world languages, what kind of summative assessments like an integrated performance assessment or IPA that you can score with rubrics to really measure the student's language learning. And then lastly is planning those learning experiences. And so planning those lessons, looking at different instructional activities to help our students achieve those goals, what kinds of authentic resources you can use, keeping that focus on what is appropriate for both the student's developmental level, their language learning, and bringing in some of those intercultural components too. So starting off with step one, we want to identify our learning outcomes. And so with our learning outcomes, we really start with the standards. And so Arizona State standards are written as proficiency-based standards. So if you haven't taken a while to look at them and lately, they're written the same regardless of whether you're teaching a second grade dual language program or whether you have a junior in high school and you're teaching, a junior their first, 1-2 class of Mandarin, right? It's the same regardless. And so you want to start with those, identifying those targeted proficiency levels. Is it a novice mid, a novice high, intermediate mid, intermediate high, wherever the students are? You then want to integrate and chunk your units with a theme, then develop essential questions and identifying can-do statements. So we're going to take you through all 5 of these steps to really examine, so that way you have a good idea of just how to do this when you leave us today. So starting with the standards, and I'm going to click out here, which I will then put into the chat for you all. We're going to start with our world and native languages standards. And so these standards, again, like I said, are the same for everybody. We have components of our modes of communication and the cultural components as well, which I think this is a fantastic graph to show you how they all mesh together. But then as you come down, we mostly deal with novice, intermediate, and advanced levels in the K-12 setting. If you get, some students may get above advanced if they've done DLA through K-12, but for the most part, our students in public school will really only reach advanced learning. Once they get to any kind of learning outside after K-12, then definitely you can see some learning in kind of that superior or distinction level here. But take a minute and go through the standards, kind of scroll through them here. You can see here are our communication standards for interpersonal communication. We have interpretive listening standards, and again, they're done by our proficiency levels. So for the purpose for today, we're going to look at our standards for a novice mid learner. And that's where I'm just going to kind of guide our learning for today. You may teach students that are at a novice low, or maybe you're at an intermediate low. But for today's purposes, we're going to stick with this. So these are all of our standards that deal with novice mid learning. And the wonderful thing about our standards is they can literally be taught with anything. It's kind of like the ELA standards. Our specialist in ELA always makes the comment about how you can teach the ELA standards using a box of cereal, which is very true. And it's the same thing with our world language standards, right? We want to use those authentic texts, but you can use anything to teach the world language standards. So this is great if you're teaching in a dual language immersion program, or if you're teaching in a middle or high school setting. Take a moment to go and look at what are your students learning in their social studies class, maybe what literature they're reading in their English class, maybe what they're doing in science class, and seeing if you can bring in some of those outside other content areas into your units. So for today, we're going to focus on 2 parts of our standards. We're going to look at the interpersonal communication standards and our cultural competencies. So we're going to look at these 2 standards and how we can meet them and do backwards design planning for interpersonal communication and our cultural competencies. So we're going to focus on communicating on very familiar topics using a variety of words and phrases that have been practiced and learned. So we see that a lot with novice learners. It's a lot of rote memorization. It's a lot of practicing and repeating in our classes. And then for the cultural competencies, we're going to look at recognizing basic practices, products, and perspectives of cultures where target language is spoken, things like greetings, holiday celebrations, body language, and participating in age-appropriate, culturally authentic activities such as celebrations, songs, games, etc. So with that as our standard for today, we're going to look at what kinds of themes could be taught with that we could focus on from a backwards design. So we've identified our standards, right? We've looked at our proficiency level. We're going to do novice mid. Now what we're going to do, and I'm going to type this in here. Whoops. Let's see. We're going to integrate and chunk into themes. What might be some units that we could develop as a for novice mid learners? So if you have your phone handy, you can just scan that QR code and type it in for a Mentimeter. I've been kind of yammering on for a while, so I want to see, and let's just brainstorm what might be some great themes for you. And I've got this here, and I'll pull this up. You can also go to menti.com and type in that code, and then just type what might be some words or themes that you think of would work well in a novice mid class. Good, we're starting to get some movement on our mentees. So introductions, family, personal introductions, greetings, social interactions. And what I'll do is I will save these and send them out as a PDF. So that way we can share all of the learning that we've done together today. Greetings, time, weather, yes, color, families, ordering food in a restaurant. Oh, tones of voices, very good, excellent, yep. Sports, wonderful. Transportation. Oh, these are all fantastic themes that we could cover in a novice mid course. Well done, excellent. All right, so go ahead and fill, ooh, I like hobby and clothing. Someone just put that in there too. Seasons. I know in Arizona, I wish we had more seasons because it sure would make teaching those so much more fun. All right, let me go back to the PowerPoint here and you guys can see that. And we're going to go ahead and move on real quick. So in Arizona, okay, Arizona is a local control state. And with that, every district and school will have their own scopes and sequences. It's not something that is provided by the Department of Ed. And so every school and district should have a scope and sequence for each kind of level of proficiency. This I did get from the Ohio Department of Education. And these were examples that they were allowed to put on their website. Arizona, we really aren't allowed to put scopes and sequences on our websites, unfortunately. But this is a great example of a scope and sequence that would work well with a novice low or novice mid learner. And so different kinds of things that you can develop around. And these would be questions that you would want to ask as you're developing these, maybe in a district PLC or a district cadre that you have, or maybe you can do this if you have that flexibility at your own school. Like what kinds of themes or ideas would you want to develop units around? Think current events and ideas that are of interest to your students. Again, we want to get that social and emotional, get those connections back with our kids. It's all about those kinds of relationships. So what do they want to learn with regards to their language learning? And then start to kind of pull these things together and chunk them. So like we had family and social relationships on our Mentimeter. And so you could do different topics like family members, school, celebrations, rites of passages. Let's see, one that I personally love here are global issues and challenges, especially if you teach middle school, right? Those kids are so just eager to learn and just have so many hormones and so much energy, and yet they want to feel important and want to feel valued, I would love to go back and use the UN sustainability goals to really guide my teaching, because they're so, you know, curious and concerned with the environment. And so use that to kind of bring in some of those things, looking at geography, capitals, food, but just environmental priorities, dining behaviors, things like that. You could do STEM and interdisciplinary items with the metric system, calendars, time. Here we've got contemporary life. You could chunk things like your clothing and music and seasons, like what you wear during different seasons could all be a part of this. And so that's where you want to go once we've done the standards, looked at our proficiency level, developed what kind of units, then kind of start to chunk those units together to really create themes that, again, our students are going to respond to. And I would really encourage you to ask your students, poll them. It still is early in the semester. Find out, what do they want to learn with language learning? And even if their parents made them get into a DLI program, or maybe their parents made them, you know, sign up for a language, or they're taking it just because they want to do something in college and they have to take a language, there still has to be something that they want to learn through that. So really try to tap into that. So again, I wanted to use today as a lot of working group with us together. So whoops, I went a little too far there. There we go. With units and themes, what I'd like to do is really kind of get practicing some kinds of essential questions. So we've got our units of themes here, and we'll just use Ohio's as an example. And now what I'm going to have us do is we're going to go out to a Jamboard. Oh, why is it not coming out there? Oh, whoops, never mind. Sorry, I'm getting off track here. So units and themes, now we come up with essential questions. Here we go. So taking two themes that we've got here of families and communities, our family members, right now we want to really develop essential questions. And so these are the questions that are going to guide your students as they acquire the target language at that particular proficiency level. So when you're developing essential questions, after you've got your themes and your topics, you really don't need many essential questions, 3 to 5, you know, maybe 7 at the most, right? But you also want to notice how your essential questions are a really good way to bring in some of those cultural components from the target language. Again, our cultural competencies are not taught to be taught as a standalone thing. They are to be taught in conjunction with the language learning. And the nice thing, when you bring in those authentic resources into your lessons, you are bringing in those cultural components. So if you're talking about food, right, and we bring in the cereal box example, right, when you bring in a cereal box of, you know, from Colombia or a cereal box from France, that's going to bring in those essential questions. So essential questions, as you're thinking about them, right? They are probing questions that you want students to be able to ask and answer throughout the whole unit. You want to develop both summative and formative questions, and those summative questions should then be tied to your unit assessment. So here is an example, again, from the Ohio Department of Ed for essential questions, things like, whom do I consider being a part of my family? Families look different all over the world. What are my friends like? How are families in the US similar to and different from families in whatever country that speaks the target language? You also have, how do celebrations in the target culture differ from our celebrations? If we talk about global issues and challenges, right? Where do they speak the target language? How has geography impacted the life of those people? Do they live in a tropical area? Do they live in an Arctic area where it's cold? And how does that influence life of those people? Who is hungry and where do they live? I think is another great question. What do my food choices say about me? What food choices are the same or different? How do eating and drinking habits how are they similar or different? So you get the idea of how you can create then standards to proficiency levels, to themes and topics, to now we want to develop those essential questions. So now we're going to get to some practice. So we've got our themes and topics. And again, writing a good essential question really is a learned skill. Because again, remember that essential question needs to be broad. It needs to be able to be answered widely by the kids. It shouldn't necessarily have right or wrong answers. We want it to be kind of thought-provoking for our kids. So we're going to practice doing essential questions here on a Jamboard. So let me pull back up the internet here, and I will type this into the chat for something a little varied and different. So if you can, go ahead, take a minute and click on that Jamboard, and that will get you out there. And if you're unfamiliar with Jamboard or haven't used it, when you get up into Jamboard, there are a couple of things here. This is the background, so I took a copy of our slide and put it out here. Up here is where we'll toggle between different Jamboards. And again, I will save these so that way we can use them and you can have them as examples for your own classrooms when you start to develop stuff. On the left here is your toolbar. So what I'd like for you to do is take a sticky here, and we're going to practice doing an essential question. So a sticky note may be what environmental issues do the people that live in blank have, and maybe how are they similar and different to my environmental issues? Right? We deal with heat, we deal with drought, and then once you make the sticky note, you just click save. You can cancel out of here. And then now we've got the sticky note. It's like a Post-it on our, and you can bring it over here and guide it over to the topic. So take a minute, and if you click on that Jamboard, that will get you into the Jamboard. And just start to brainstorm what might be some great essential questions that you could think of and use for those themes for a novice mid-class. If you are struggling with getting into the Jamboard, you can type your essential questions into the chat for me if you want, if that's a little bit easier. Oh, I like that one. How many members live in your house? Because that's going to be different from country to country, right? And it's also going to change over time. You know, American families have been slowly shrinking in the birth rates of people. So that's a really good one to ask and examine. Good, we're starting to get them popping in now. Yeah, so just take your Post-it when you get them in and kind of move them around to the topic, then we can see all of them here. Oh, I like that one. What might be challenges moving from one country to another? Oh, these are some great questions. Here, let's move some of these over here so we see them all. Let's see, personal. Oh, here's music. Where can we put music? Oops. There we go. Oh, I like that. How often do you communicate using a device? What I like about these too, and you can do this with your kids, sometimes I would take and just have a stack of Post-it notes and I would give them to my kids at the beginning of a unit. Hey, write down questions that you have about what we're going to learn. Maybe I'll do a little bit of an intro. Okay, we're going to be talking about, families and communities and social relationships. What questions do you have? And I would have the students actually write out questions on a Post-it note, put it up on the wall on a board. And then as we went through the unit and their question was answered, they got to move that question over to an answered section. And so we could see all of the questions that were asked and answered as well. These are fantastic. Oh, fashion. Yep, that's a good one. I'm going to move some of these around. Oh, here's energy, rites of passages, fashion, we can put down here. Oh, here we go. Some science and STEM celebrations. Oh, percentage of tipping. There you go. I think that's a great one, right? Oh, yeah, that's a good one for college and career. What do people do to prepare for their careers in other countries? What do the school systems look like? These are all fantastic. Oh, this is a great one. How do the celebrations represent the value of culture in a community? I think that's a wonderful one too. I'm going to move that up over here. These are fantastic. Great. Wonderful. So now we've got our standards. We've got our proficiency levels. We've chunked our units and themes together. We've now developed some essential questions. The last piece of this, and I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint here and keep this Jamboard up because we will use it again. So the next piece is can-do statements. And so I will admit, when I first heard about can-do statements, I was not really that thrilled about them. I thought that they sounded a little bit lame, to be honest with you. But I will say I am a total convert now. So can-do statements are something that was created by NACESFL, which are state supervisors of world languages, along with ACTFL, which is the American Council for Teachers for Languages. And they very explicitly help students to know what level of proficiency they are at, and to also know exactly what they need to do to move to that next level of proficiency. So on ACTFL's website, you can actually find can-do statements for every level of language learning. And in fact, here I will put that into the chat here, just so you have it. I will also save a copy of the chat and send it out with all of the resources from today as well. And so these are just generic statements, and they're perfect to use as a guide as you create can-do statements for your units throughout the year. So for example, this is interpretive, our 3 modes of communication. So we have interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational. And you can see the novice benchmark, and then you can see the intermediate benchmark. So a novice benchmark for interpersonal, which that's the standard that we were going to focus on today, is I can spontaneously communicate spontaneous spoken, written, or signed conversations on both familiar and everyday topics using a variety of practiced or memorized words, phrases, simple sentences, and questions. And then we're also going to do the cultural I can statements. And in this case, for the standard that we picked earlier in the session, we're going to compare, I can identify, products and practices to help me understand perspectives. So that's where we know our students are on a novice level with these kind of generic I can statements. So then this is actually, so the link that I sent to you also had the more in-depth novice ones. So you can actually look and see, we can go from a novice mid to then a novice high. And we know we want to take our students to participate in spontaneous spoken, written, or signed conversations on familiar topics, creating sentences and a series of sentences to ask and answer a variety of questions. So you can see how the I can statements change ever so slightly from a novice mid to a novice high. And again, we want to share these with our kids. It shouldn't be some super secret thing that they don't know about. They should absolutely know where they're at and where they're going to be successful. And then also, if we take it from a novice mid cultural components to in my own and other cultures, I can make comparisons between products and practices to help me understand perspectives. So again, this is what we want to do. We want to let kids know where they're at with their I can statements and also where they're going. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're literally saying, I can do this, because that was my problem with it. It's just that idea that they can identify those where they're at and where they're going. So we're going to go back out to our Jamboard. And now if you come back out to the Jamboard, up at the top here is I don't know, it's a rectangle. And these are the different pages. So as you come up here, I'd like for you to click over one. And here we have I can statements. So if we take one of our units, let's say we're talking about family relationships, right? If we take this as our unit, and we'll just stick with family relationships. If we take family relationships here, what could be an I can statement for a novice mid person? So in this case, we could say, I can describe my family in the target language. So again, we've taken that generic statement, right, of, I can communicate spontaneous and spoken written word with practiced or using variety of, memorized phrases. We take that and now we make it specific for our particular unit. So think if you want to use family, if you want to use any unit, but take a moment to practice writing an I can statement for novice mid, and then also writing what can be an I can statement for the next level up, high. So maybe a high one could be, I can explain how my family is similar to a family in blank. Oh, good. I can identify members of the royal family in Spain. There you go. I can express basic needs for surviving on a base in Mars. I love that. That's fantastic. And you're talking STEM, all that science stuff. I'm telling you, you will be the best friend of your content teachers if you just take a minute to just get the general idea of what they're teaching at the time. So perfect example of how much fun it can be. For my last teaching, I was teaching in a high school, and the Spanish teacher and I was teaching economics at the time. We got together so that way we were discussing what was going on with the collapse of Venezuela's economy at the time. And so it was fantastic because my economics kids would then go into their Spanish class and talk about the cultural components and everything. And it was reinforcing everything that was going on. And it was so much fun. And the kids got such a kick out of the fact that we had tied economics and Spanish together. And even for those kids that didn't, the kids that did have both of us as teachers really were able to have conversations with the kids and go through and help them and do all different kinds of things. So take a minute and see if we can write some other I can statements. Or if you can't, with the chat clicking over, feel free to put them into the chat too. Oh, good. I can identify Spanish speaking countries around the world. That's a great one. Oh, I like that. I can ask how people are related to one another. Oh, good. I can talk about my school schedule. That's another good one. Wonderful. These are really great. I can locate Spanish speaking countries around the world. I can discuss my daily routine when I begin my day. That's another great one. You know, first I get up and I brush my teeth, you know, second, something else. I can introduce myself using personal information in the target language. Oh, I can identify a source of green energy. These are all fantastic. So you're getting the idea, right? I can just, when you come up with your units and after you identify your essential questions, right, you want to almost be able to kind of answer those questions and take those generic I can statements and have those in there. And these I can statements then become part of your formative and summative assessments. I can understand simple feedback on a homework assignment. I can recognize whether a correspondence is formal or informal. These are great. Wonderful. All right. So basically now I'm going to take us back to our PowerPoint here. We have gone through all 5 of those steps of identifying our learning outcomes. So now step 2 is determining acceptable evidence. So when we determine acceptable evidence, this really is what should be the evidence. We determine what assessments will be given to show the evidence that the students have understood and achieved the learning outcomes of the unit. So a summative integrated performance assessment, or IPA, scored with rubrics is really what we recommend. As an IPA does encompass really all authentic cultural resources. It encompasses performance tasks across all of our modes of communication. So if you don't use IPAs yet, it's definitely something to take a minute to look into, especially for your summative assessments. I don't recommend IPAs for formative assessments because they are too in-depth, but when you really look at a summative assessment, think of doing an IPA for that. And so let's talk a little bit more about this. So when we're determining those assessments, we are using both formative and summative. And so formative, really, I like the idea of formative equals feedback. And that's really what we're thinking of when we're doing this. It's assessment for learning as opposed to of learning. It's guided instruction and achievement that's focused on the tasks by checking for understanding during that learning process. Formative assessments also inform us as teachers, but it also informs the students through that feedback of just how they can close that gap between where they are and where they need to be. And it also is based on that targeted learning and that proficiency standard. So it's really nice because everything gets tied back to the standards, which is what we want. We want proficiency-based classrooms. Then the other thing about formative assessments that's important is that they are timely. They should be detailed in feedback between, a conversation between student and teacher that allows both of them to move that learning process forward. So you don't want to do a formative assessment and then you don't give anything back to the students until, 2 weeks later. Some examples of formative assessments could be a nonverbal response. So it could be something with a whiteboard. I went and had a big sheet of whiteboards at Lowe's. And because I was a teacher, they cut them into 12 by 12 squares for me for free. It was totally cheap. And then I just had the whiteboard markers and the kids then, hold them up in class. And it was really easy for me to get that instant feedback of yes, they got it or no, they didn't. You could also do hand gestures, fist to 5 or thumbs up, thumbs down. All of those kinds of things work well too. Short quizzes over specific vocabulary, different kind of discrete grammar things, a think, pair, share, TPR or more kinesthetic activities where you're asking kids to get up, sit down, move, do this, do that. Those kinds of activities are great formative assessments that let you know where your kids are. KWL charts, role plays, exit slips are great. Polling, different things that you can do, things like clickers or poll everywhere, or I loved Quizlet Live, was a really fun one to do because then the kids had to get together in groups and work together. Peer editing, monitoring, and observations are just some of the formative assessments that I've used and that are options. Definitely, summative is the summary of learning, right? This is the assessment of learning. It allows students to apply what they know and what they can do at the end of an instructional unit or an extended period of time. It also allows you to determine whether the student has performed at that targeted level of proficiency, and if you need to maybe go back to that, and looking at their performance versus proficiency, because those are two very different things that we look at with language learning. Examples could be an integrated performance assessment, like I said, or an IPA. It could be an oral presentation or an interview. It could be a comprehensive reading or listening assignment. It could be a project or a portfolio that you have your students do. It could be a unit, semester, or final exam. It could also be a comprehensive, written assessment in some way as well. So what I'd like to do is hear from you guys, and in the chat, I'd like for you to type in for me, what is your favorite formative assessment that you like to use in the classroom? I always like to kind of divvy it up. I used to have, I had playing cards actually that were blank, and I would write formative assessments on the back of them. And sometimes I would flip it up. I'd let a kid pick. And so we would do different things like that. Definitely Kahoot is a super fun one. Exit tickets are great. My science department was notorious for printing a whole bunch of stuff. And I say this in a lot of my training, so you may have heard me say this before, but they would print just on one side of the paper and then throw it in the recycle bin. I would go and get like a ream of paper that was printed on just one side. I would cut it into fourths, so then I'd have these squares, and I would use those as exit tickets. Oh, I like that question feature on Google Classroom is great. Bluekit, I'm not familiar with that one. I'll have to look that one up. Word walls, fantastic. Gimkit is a great one. Thank you. Yes. Oh yeah, presenting on their foods and activities. Google Forms. Yeah, why not use a Google form, right? And solicit questionnaires, have kids go out and collect data from other kids using the target language. I think that would be fantastic, right? It's all just different ways to engage kids doing different things. Seesaw, another good one. Excellent. These are all great. Again, I will save all of the chat and send it out to you as we're going forward. So getting into an IPA, just to kind of get into it a little bit, again, I could probably have an entire session on just IPAs, but IPA is really that a cluster kind of assessment where you're featuring our 3 tasks, right? Which has our 3 modes of communication. So you've got interpretive communication, interpersonal communication, and presentational communication. Of the 3 tasks, we align them into a single theme or content area. We then reflect in the manner in which students just kind of naturally acquire and use language in the real world and in the classroom. Each task of an IPA provides information and elicits linguistic interaction that is necessary for students to complete the subsequent task, meaning that they're designed for the students at really any level of proficiency, and they did show where they're at with those tasks. And then that's how you know if they're meeting that. IPAs are designed to be used with scoring rubrics that rate their performance in terms of whether that meets expectations, exceeds expectations, or does not quite meet expectations for whatever task you have determined for them. And what I like about it is it's more of that asset-based grading. It's not marking kids off for what they don't know. It's really focused on what kids do know. And switching to asset-based grading, I think, is a real positive way to really focus on the kids. And it brings in some of those relationships, more of that social and emotional learning, because you're not treating it like it's a deficit, like it's some kind of negative thing. It's like, hey, what do you know? Great, this is where you're at. Fantastic. What can we do to get you further, right? So one thing an IPA isn't. An IPA is not busy work. It's also not a formative assessment. It is not something that should be done in a day. So if you're thinking of using IPAs, you definitely want to think of using them. You'll be using them over multiple days. It is not meant to be done in isolation, and you really should be using authentic resources that should be part of whatever theme or unit you're doing. If you're doing some kind of science or STEM, then look at maybe some of the, websites that are from that country, a country in the target language that speaks on that. Some science organizations, teachers of science in, say, Colombia or in, say, France, right? And pull up what do those science teachers, what do they use in the target language? And honestly, just start off small. Don't think of having to do all of your summative assessments as IPAs to begin with, but just start by adding multiple activities as a piece of your unit assessment. Use something that you feel is similar, something that you are familiar with, and something that your students are familiar with as well. So that way you can do those different activities to reinforce it. And really just start by picking, okay, I'm going to do one IPA if you don't use any, and this is the unit that I'm going to do it for. And just start to kind of collect it and think of how you're doing it. So like I mentioned, IPAs really are all about tasks, and they are authentic. They're what you do in the real world in any language setting, in any target country in the world. They are developmental in nature. So you can use the same task, but maybe depending upon if you're teaching a novice or an intermediate or an advanced, that task is going to look a lot different. And again, they should be integrated. So different tasks that you could do would be getting to an airport and getting through security and traveling and finding a lost suitcase, right? So different parts of that can be more novice, or it could be more advanced or intermediate, depending upon your students, but getting through the airport to travel somewhere. Ordering meals in a restaurant, asking for substitutions or a refill, asking for the check. It could be an interview, using an infographic as a guide. It could be a guess who kind of thing where students have to ask and answer questions of others. I would do this where I went to the dollar store and I got cheap headbands, and I would make the kids put the headbands on their head like this. And then I would just get index cards and I would write someone's name on it, and they'd have the index card on their head. And high school students look stupid, but they loved doing this. And then they'd have to go around and ask who the person was to figure it out. And when they did figure out, then they could come to me. I could give them another new person. I could take the headbands home and wash them, and so they didn't get gross. And so it was perfect. And so that's a fun thing to do. Pictionary, that's where you can use the whiteboards. They can tell stories using the whiteboards to one another. You could do a speed dating thing where they have to interview and find someone that's compatible with them, or doing things in history where they have to match things by doing like a speed dating thing. You can do like a pin the clothes on the clown, card games, some kind of online scavenger hunt. There are a lot of examples of these, and I'm going to put this into the chat. So the federal government has given different universities funding for what are called Title VI schools, and these are National Foreign Language Resource Centers. There's one at the University of Arizona. It's called Circle, CERCLL. They occasionally have trainings and things like that. And in fact, the Arizona Language Association Conference is next weekend in Tucson, and Circle is helping to host that. Carla is the one out of the University of Minnesota. And I think there are 12 or 14 Title VI foreign language resource centers. And in fact, they just have given funding for a Native American, for an Indigenous languages foreign language resource center, which I'm really excited. Each one of these language centers through the university has a focus, and Carla is all about IPAs. So again, don't reinvent the wheel. Use what others have out there because they're funded from the federal government. They are all online open education resource, and it's fantastic that you can use that. So these are just some examples of different things that you can do for an IPA: Jigsaw, short stories, news media, social media. I had kids do Facebook posts where I just gave them like an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with a template on it. And they would have to do a Facebook post of like a person from the target country. So that would be great. Presentational, all sorts of stuff. You could have them do infographics using Canva and all those things. Pictochart are all free now. So I'd have students do that sort of stuff as well. So don't forget, when you are doing your IPAs, that you do need to bring in that cultural component, again, with our 3 modes of communication, and look to authentic and real world examples and real world tasks and scenarios. And this may be something too, where polling your kids and asking them what they want to learn, make an IPA off what they want to learn as far as the language goes and take it from there. Again, really engaging them in what they're responsible for their learning. So IPAs do deal with performance and proficiency. So again, these are 2 kind of different pieces of our standards. And so performance, this IPA, it's given as a summative assessment at the end of an instructional unit to determine if the learner has really achieved relative to the concepts that were taught. The tasks are based on material for the unit. Learners can prepare to do these things through rehearsal and that practice performance, right? Tasks are based on that central theme with those 3 modes of communication. And again, we're not checking and giving grammar tests or vocabulary tests. It's that idea that naturally kids pick that up over time as we model it and examine it. And so it's very discrete grammar. It's not like a big part of like, hey, we have a grammar test and tell me what these verb tenses are. IPAs also can be proficiency based, where it's not practice, right? This can be at the extended period of time to demonstrate that non-rehearsed content. It can be used as a pre or post assessment for evaluative purposes. It can be a semester final or exam. The tasks, when it's proficiency based, are spontaneous and they're not practiced ahead of time. And so this is really measuring where your kids are in their learning of the language. It should be across a central theme, across all 3 modes of communication again, and it shouldn't be something that was recently covered. Again, because we want to check that difference between proficiency versus performance. The students will then, in a performance IPA, or excuse me, proficiency IPA, will draw upon all of that acquired language over the course of time and accomplish that through those communicative tasks. Also, again, proficiency wise, it doesn't test, it's very little grammar. It's not grammar and vocab based. That's not what an IPA is. So in order to do an IPA efficiently, you do have to use rubrics. And so rubrics, again, are that standardized scoring tool that assess our students' performances. They're composed of sets of criteria. It describes those expectations in student-friendly manner. And again, it's not something that's super secret, right? Let the kids know about the rubrics, let them see what it is, and go forward in that way. It focuses on those key elements and they're aligned to the proficiency levels of where we want students to live. And the nice thing about rubrics, it makes your life easier because you can grade so much quicker and faster, giving that feedback to the students as well. So you can do different things with rubrics, right? You could do a full rubric, you can do a single rubric. It's totally up to you, depending upon what you need. Using descriptors like meeting or exceeding expectations or partially meeting expectations, you can use it for all levels: novice, mid, novice, intermediate, or advanced. You use them to determine proficiency. You can also do just a single rubric, right? That just is measuring one discrete skill, maybe one thing interpersonal that they can do. Always leave space for self-reflection, for goal setting, and for feedback, and definitely note those strengths and areas of improvement. Again, this is all about asset-based grading. It's not about those deficiencies of, oh, what you did not do. It's, hey, this is what you did, and this is just what you need to add on to get to that next level. So again, like all good teachers, the Ohio Department of Education has some fantastic rubrics that you can already use. And so here's one example for an interpersonal performance rubric. You can use it for here, novice low, novice mid, novice high. This is, they do theirs as strong, good, and developing, or emerging, or low. So you could make those distinctions there. Again, this is looking at the I can statements, developing those rubrics around those. So you've got comprehension, interaction, and some intercultural ability. And so it's great because you could literally just write on here feedback wise, score it. You could then assign a point value to it if you wanted, and it makes it very quick and easy for your students. And again, let them know, let your parents know. Then everything is out front. You don't have any questions about why things were one way or another, or why did Johnny not do this as opposed to doing that. It's out there on the rubric, and it's very easy to make your life a little bit easier using those rubrics and that kind of asset-based model. Again, this is a little bit more of a in-depth one. So you can see like they've got the idea of going from novice to intermediate. This is like a final score of, you know, did they, is it strong, good, developing, or emerging? You can assign a point value to it. So that way you can put something into the grade book. And so this is another example of one from the Ohio rubrics. Yes, you will get all of these linked, and these are all hyperlinked for you. So that way you have them when I send you the presentation in a day or two. So in the chat, I've been talking a while. So how do you currently use rubrics, and how might you use rubrics in the future? Good. So when you assign an assignment, in this day and age too, just for transparency, I would post my rubrics online. You know, it makes it really easy to avoid, you know, conflicts, maybe anything controversial, that you could put them if you have like a Google Classroom, or if you have a Canva class, post those generic ones out there. So that way, you know, parents can see them as well as teachers. Yeah, definitely using rubrics for self-grading, I think, is a huge thing. Because again, this is not something that's secret, right? We want our kids to know proficiency-wise where they're at and where they're going. So let the kids grade themselves, you know? I think it's a great way to do those things. Writing essays, good. Someone's used full rubrics. Yeah, definitely it helps to make that accountability. Projects and role playing. These are great. Rubrics to assess students' oral presentations for year-end IPA. Oh, wonderful. That's fantastic. And then the students would choose what they would not present on, choosing food or other sports. Oh, that's great. Evaluating exhibit. Oh, these are great. Perfect. Yeah, I like them. I would use rubrics. I would do like a Socratic seminar kind of thing where I would give kids a topic in more of an advanced class where I'd want them to have a conversation, and they would know like how many times they had to answer questions, and how many times they had to ask a question, and keeping that kind of prep available for some of those interpersonal things, or presentation wise. It's real easy to get that. Wonderful. All right. So that is basically all of step 2, right? Which is determining that acceptable evidence. So it's all about formative versus summative assessments, and where you're going with that, planning and using those rubrics. And if you don't use IPAs, think and consider of adding that into your toolbox of assessments. So now we're getting to step 3, where now we finally get to plan our lessons, right, in a backwards design class. So as you're planning experiences, and for me, this is actually where I get into the really fun things, right? You want to use your students' prior knowledge, use those can-do statements, use all modes of communication, interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational, use those cultural competencies and authentic resources, target different teaching and learning strategies, right? Everybody learns differently. Don't do the same thing every time. Look and evaluate, okay, where have you been doing the same thing? Or maybe where have you gotten into a rut? Or maybe are you a little stale that you want to beef something up, and try and think of something new to do. Using those formative assessments as ways to achieve those kind of checks on learning. Again, that keeps that touch in with your kids. So that way they're know where they're at as well, and using technology. So a lot of you had mentioned some really kind of neat and cool, innovative technologies. If there's one that you're not familiar with, I would say pick one. Pick one to do something different. Get that in with your kids. Find out other teachers, what they've had successes with, things like that. And really just plan and scaffold those learning activities to really have the students achieve those goals by the end of the unit. Because again, that's the whole point of each and every lesson. We know where we want our kids to be with regards to the standards and what goals we want them to have at the end of that unit. And so what lesson can we do as we stair step along the way, taking our kids along that path, getting them to that final destination. So things to consider, and this I stole from Josh Cabral, who is a great world language teacher. He has a podcast if you ever get a chance to listen to it. And so I took this from his advice on what to consider when doing backwards design and creating lesson plans for it and learning activities. So he recommends, and I think these are great. So what are the vocabulary themes necessary to reach those goals and objectives? Like what kind of vocabulary do you need to have your students get a grasp on in order to get to that desired outcome? Another thing to consider is what are the language structures necessary to reach those goals? Do you need to learn a past tense? Do you need to learn a future tense? Do they need to learn how to do something grammatically without doing grammar worksheets? Do it in the way that you would normally acquire that language, right? Grammar worksheets and grammar activities are a surefire way to just turn off kids' engagement, right? But modeling over and over again what is proper grammar using kind of that PACE model is a great way to do it. Another thing to consider is what activities would provide opportunities to meet the goals and desired outcomes using those 3 modes of communication. Again, keeping in mind we need to do interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational. And then lastly, the thing to consider is what tasks will provide students with opportunities to use the language to accomplish a goal that is independent of practicing the language structures and thematic vocabulary. What that means, and it's a mouthful, is what activities can you do that will get your kids to move from performance to proficiency, right? Where they are moving along that path and they aren't doing necessarily that rote memorization, but they're actually able to take some of that prior knowledge, take that learning and apply it to an unknown, unrehearsed setting. And so think of those kinds of activities. So when you're planning your activities and you're thinking of the rubrics, right? Think of rubrics. Do you want a full rubric for meeting and exceeding, or do you want that single rubric? And then where are you going to then apply those in there? And then lastly, we get to the actual planning of experiences, right? So these are all different things of conversation circles, which are great where students prepare questions, asking their peers new vocabulary words as they like sit in a circle. And then one student asks another student, and then that student answers, and then they kind of move around the circle asking questions. I've done it too, where I've had kids, I call them like little mini debates, where I'll have a group of 3 kids doing something with, we'll just say set A, and then we'll have a group of 3 kids doing B, and they have to have a conversation about it. Like maybe it's like water usage in the target country compared to this. So like one's going to say, oh, we use a lot, or the other say we don't use a lot. And so they have to do it. And then what I do is I then rotate the groups. And so the 3 groups, one, it's nice because it lowers that affective level because you're in a group of 2 or 3, but then they have to debate then someone else in a new group B. So I'll give them 5 minutes to talk, and then the A's stay solid, stay stationary, and then the B groups kind of rotate around the room. And I like that because one, they're doing it in groups and they're still debating the same thing every time, but they're doing it with a new group. So different things will kind of come up. Jigsaws are another great way to have students sit in groups of 2, 3, 4. Each pair of students has a group or aspect where they discuss part of it and then share with their partner, and then everybody comes back together to do that. A picture prompt is another fun one where you're asking students to bring in a picture that could be a prompt for a discussion. And then you use those pictures in paired groups to express an opinion or have a discussion. They can tell a story. They can do this either writing or orally. You could also do like inside outside circles. That kind of gets to more of that Socratic seminar thing where you have students prepare things ahead of time to either listen to, read, or study. You can have students stand like in the inside or the outside circle, and then they take time going in. You can use timers to monitor all of that. Asking kids to do limited different things. Think, pair, share is another great one that I know a lot of teachers have in their toolbox already. So if you already do this, think of this as like great, keep it up, do some more different things with it. Using like poll everywhere, you can ask kids to share what they think and then what they're doing with the whole class. You can also do different problem solving activities. So have students work together to solve problems like, how do you wash a car? How do you solve a problem of 76,509 divided by 13, right? You could have them do charts and graphs. What's the fastest way to get from point A to point B? And then how do you do that taking the train? How would you do that taking the subway? And then the students have to determine the fastest way to get there, maybe the cost of what that would entail, specific occasions, like what do you say if this happens, or what do you say when? Advertising, all of those kinds of things are ways that you can get kids to really involved in their language learning and do some problem solving. All right, so then the last thing I'm going to share with you today, and I'm going to put you into breakout rooms here. So I'm going to pause the recording for just recording. All right, so definitely Harvard Project Zero is my new favorite thing of just tons of resources for you to look at and examine and use in any way possible. So we're going to go ahead and move on. I wanted to take you out to the World in Native Languages website real quick. And again, just to show you, because we have been really working at beefing things up. So we have our Seal of Biliteracy. We're also putting out here latest news and updates. So this is something that Hannah has done a fantastic job on. Here's our September newsletter. There's an introduction to Islam and Africa digital workshop. We are asking for student designs to redo the Seal of Biliteracy, which will be fantastic. So as we get things that we could not put into the newsletter, this is where we put latest news and updates. We also have here classroom resources that we are slowly beefing up. We've got general resources. We try to put Spanish, French, Chinese, German, ASL, some of our critical and native languages, and some assessment resources. So this is where you can find already the Carla IPAs that we talked about earlier, all those rubrics, we already have them linked on here. And then the Center for Applied Linguistics, CAL, has a really great understanding assessments tutorial here. So we have these that we've been beefing up on our website. We also have our videos here that you can come and look at. Some of our videos, we'll be putting this out here, as well as I will be adding the slide deck to it here for you all. And then Lastly, we have our newsletter. So you can click on this link and this will sign you up for our monthly newsletter that Hannah puts out. And so this is a great way to get the latest resources. We do it K-12. We do all different kinds of languages, from the really commonly taught languages like French and Spanish and Mandarin, but we also put out stuff for less commonly taught languages like ASL, or maybe even like Romanian, or I think I put some Swedish, things out there. And there's nothing that says you can't use some of those languages. If you have a student that's like, oh, my heritage is Swedish, I want to learn Swedish, and they're in your Mandarin class, well, great. How are some things similar and different to Swedish, and pull up some of those Swedish resources, right? Again, meeting the needs of the kids and wanting to engage them in as much as we can. So with that, let's see, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. There we go. So you guys can see this okay still? So our time is up today. I apologize that the Harvard Project Zero wasn't quite working for you all. If you can type your first and last name into the chat, I would appreciate it. That will help me just to double check your attendance. You will need to get an email from me that will verify that your attendance is complete. At that point in time, then you can print out your certificate saying that you have an hour and a half of professional learning credit that you can use for certificate renewal or with your district. Definitely, this is a newer presentation, so if you have any feedback, please let us know. Feel free to email Hannah or myself. And I want to say thank you so much for coming. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this time.